Hi folks, I'm going to keep this brief. If you want to support the work I do here on this channel, which is there's a lot of drawing, you can see it, you can do so at patreon.com/John D Ruddy. Hugely appreciated, really needed, so thank you so much in advance for joining the cause. This is part 2. This is being released just before the 2024 election, so good luck.
Manny Man does history. Never again after Monroe would a candidate run unopposed, and the election of 1824 would certainly make up for the simplicity of 1820. Though no strong political opposition stood against the Democratic Republicans, the party itself began to splinter as motivations and values seemed to differ partially between North and South. Several candidates emerged, with Secretary of State John Quincy Adams of the North, war hero General Andrew Jackson of the South, and also Secretary of the Treasury William H. Crawford, and Speaker of the House Henry Clay, the man who kept running for president. Candidates needed 131 out of 261 available electoral votes to win, which no one achieved. Andrew Jackson had won the popular vote and most electoral votes with 99, but the choice was now up to the US House of Representatives, who chose John Quincy Adams. To many in the South, particularly Andrew Jackson, this seemed like all sorts of corruption from the Northerners and would further a growing rift between North and South, especially as it looked like Adams had bought Henry Clay's support with the job of Secretary of State. All of this ruptured the Democratic-Republican Party completely, and from it came the Democratic Party, led by Jackson, and the National Republican Party, led by Adams. This being the emergence of the second party system. Politics became dirty as the parties delved into personal insults of their opponents. The 1828 election saw non-landowning white men allowed to vote, greatly expanding the American voter base to a whopping 9.5% of America's population voting for the president. Jackson won a decisive victory over Adams. Vengeance is a dish best served cold. The election of 1832 saw the first use of presidential nominating conventions for party members to publicly choose their party's presidential candidate. Henry Clay would make another run at the presidency for the National Republicans in 1832, as did incumbent Jackson and two new parties, John Floyd of the Nullifier Party, who were all about states' rights to nullify federal laws, especially if it tried to interfere with slavery, and William Wirt of the Anti-Masonic Party, opposing Freemasonry in the North and in turn elitism and blind political loyalty. Andrew Jackson won an even bigger victory this time with his new Vice President Martin Van Buren, as it seemed like having more than two parties in this electoral system could split votes dramatically. Following this election, the National Republicans, Anti-Masons, and even some disgruntled Democrats gravitated together to oppose Jackson, ultimately forming the Whig Party. Ironically, they didn't have much support from poor farmers or unskilled workers, as they wavered from skeptical to outright hostile against American expansionism and the idea of manifest destiny, that Americans were destined to push out west and control it all. At the end of his presidency, Jackson would be the oldest president at 69, just shy of his 70th birthday. He'd hold this record for over 120 years. In the lead up to the 1836 election, the Whig Party couldn't decide on a candidate, so they devised an interesting strategy to oppose Democrat Martin Van Buren. They would run 4 candidates, including War of 1812 General William Henry Harrison, in the hope that it would split everyone's votes so thin that it would result in no one achieving the required electoral votes and forcing another contingent election like in 1825. The only problem was they only split the Whig Party vote, and Van Buren ran away with the election, winning more electoral votes than the Whig Party candidates combined, and 51% of the popular vote. This was Arkansas and Michigan's first election. It wouldn't prove all that great though, as Van Buren's popularity would wane as the economy suffered after the Panic of 1837. William Henry Harrison returned for a rematch in 1840, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and won a decisive victory over Van Buren. This was the first presidential victory for the Whig Party. At the age of 67, Harrison became the oldest president elected until Ronald Reagan. He was gonna do big things, but then he died just over a month into his presidency. At this point, it was unclear what specifically was to happen regarding the presidency, if another election would be held or what, but Vice President John Tyler took matters into his own hands, had himself sworn in, and became the new president, aiming to complete the rest of Harrison's 4-year term. Unfortunately for the Whig Party, Tyler, being a former Democrat, was obstinate and blocked most of what the Whig Party wanted to get done, so they kicked him out of the party and he stayed on as an independent president. He moved to try and annex Texas to hopefully win a second term, but he had stabbed too many in the back. The election of 1844 saw the emergence of former Speaker of the House James K. Polk as the Democratic nominee. He was a strong supporter of Manifest Destiny and the push out west, and quickly overshadowed Tyler's attempts to campaign for re-election. Henry Clay was back again to take another crack at the presidency as the leader of the Whig Party. He was popular, but his message was muddled, as he seemed hesitant about the expansion of slavery, while also being the owner of human beings. The popular vote was very, very close, with only 40,000 votes in it. But that didn't matter because the Electoral College meant that Polk had won in the correct states, winning him 65 more electoral votes than Clay, and indeed winning him the presidency. Up until this point, the election wasn't held specifically across the states on one day, although they had to be completed before the first Wednesday of December. A Tuesday was usually chosen for an election, so voters, who were usually farmers, would have time to go to church on Sunday, travel to the polling location on Monday, vote on Tuesday, and be ready to sell their produce at the market on Wednesday. However, with the development of Morse code being sent across electric telegraph wires, Congress decided to hold the election on one single day to avoid information spreading across the states and possibly influencing the elections. This day would be the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November and would remain that way ever since. Polk certainly lived up to his expansionist rhetoric by annexing Texas and indeed the entire southwest region from Mexico. He'd promised to be a one-term president, so the presidency was up for grabs again in 1848. This time the Whigs did not let Henry Clay run. No presidency for you, Clay. Instead, they went with the war hero General Zachary Taylor. Vice nominee was Millard Fillmore, who was a New Yorker with moderate views on slavery, and was involved with the Native American movement, not anything to do with actual indigenous people. This was a "we were born here" white Anglo-Saxon Protestant movement that opposed the new wave of immigration of European Catholics. The Democrats put forward Lewis Cass, while Martin Van Buren broke from the Democrats to run as part of the Free Soil Party and oppose slavery expanding into the Western Territories. This slavery issue was probably going to come to a head at some point as the can continued to be kicked down the road. Taylor and Cass both won 15 states each, but Taylor won the right combination of states, so he won more electoral votes. This was Texas, Florida, Iowa, and Wisconsin's first election. As the slavery debate went on, rumblings of secession, states leaving the Union of the United States, began to stir, both in the North and increasingly more so in the South. Zachary Taylor died just over a year into office of what seemed like food poisoning, leaving the presidency to Millard Fillmore. He went along with the Compromise of 1850, which banned slavery in Washington, D.C., but in turn brought in harsher fugitive slave laws, defined the border of Texas, allowed for slavery in the Southwest, except for California, which was admitted as a free state. Fillmore was too relaxed on slavery for the Whig Party, so in 1852 they put forward military commander Winfield Scott as their candidate. Slavery was dividing even the Democratic Party, so to reach northern voters they put forward New Hampshire candidate Franklin Pierce, to great effect as he won 27 out of 31 states. This was California's first election. The Free Soil Party ran John P. Hale, but got nothing. Scott's anti-slavery stance didn't go down well in the South, and indeed the issue of slavery was tearing the Whig Party asunder. Northern Whig members joined forces with the Free Soil Party to form the Republican Party in 1854. The Whig president, Millard Fillmore, got more involved in his anti-Catholic immigration Know-Nothing Party. He would run for president in 1856, while the very first Republican presidential candidate became John C. Fremont, an explorer and military officer. The Republicans' initial stance on slavery was that of regulation and curtailing its spread, as opposed to full-on abolition. The Democrats put forward another Northerner, James Buchanan, former Secretary of State and Ambassador to the UK. Because he'd been out of the country in the UK, he seemed a bit more separate from the divisive slavery issue, which had blown up into a state-level civil war in the Kansas Territory. He won a confident victory, only failing to get most of the northern states. This marked the end of the second party system. The Know-Nothing Party would evolve into the Constitutional Union Party. The election of 1860 is the one that literally broke the country. Abraham Lincoln emerged as the Republican candidate, pushing back against the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Supreme Court ruling of Dred Scott v. Sanford, which decided that black people are not entitled to American citizenship and thus cannot be protected by the Constitution. The Constitutional Union Party tried to call for unity between North and South and put forward John Bell. The Democrats initially nominated Illinois man Stephen A. Douglas, but his stance on states having the right to choose whether or not they have slavery threatened many in the South, so Southern Democrats put forward another candidate, John C. Breckinridge. He won strongly across the South, but Abraham Lincoln won more electoral votes than the other three candidates combined, becoming the first Republican president. This was the last straw for the South, as they one by one declared their secession from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America, which would lead to the American Civil War. This election was the first for Oregon and Minnesota. Gasconade County voted Republican for the first time in that election and has done so ever since, becoming the longest running active voting streak for a county in America. That's kind of cool. Also, Lincoln's vice president was named Hannibal Hamlin, which is just like an excellent name. Hannibal Hamlin. It's fun to say, Hannibal Hamlin. The Confederacy formed their own electoral college to elect their president in November 1861, where they unanimously elected nonpartisan Jefferson Davis as their president, who was to sit a 6-year term of office, but the Confederacy didn't last that long, dissolving after just over 4 years, and indeed losing the Civil War. I will say this. The thought of a 6-year term does not sound horrendous, especially in a world where we're in a non-stop media cycle of elections and midterms and more time thinking about re-election than policy. That being said, the Confederacy's policy on slavery was abhorrent, so... During the war, Republicans and some Democrats within the Union formed the National Union Party to promote unity and to attract more Democrats to their side. Democrats in the war were generally divided into Copperheads, who wanted an immediate peace with the Confederacy, whereas the War Democrats, as the name suggests, supported the war against the South. Along with having to run the country and run the war and free most of the enslaved people, Lincoln had to run for re-election in 1864, heading the National Union Party, this time running with War Democrat Andrew Johnson for vice president. Former Union General George B. McClellan ran as the Democrat candidate, initially campaigning for peace, but as 1864 went on, he changed his mind as the Confederacy seemed to be collapsing. Previous Republican candidate John C. Fremont ran under the Radical Democracy Party, calling for the Confederacy to be utterly defeated, rebel property confiscated, banning slavery, equal rights, etc., but he dropped out before the election. Lincoln had been playing a delicate game when it came to not completely estranging the South during the war, so he was more moderate than some. However, as the war went on, it became clear that slavery was the crux of so much of this division, and it would continue to divide the nation for as long as it existed. And also, owning people as property was bad, actually. He had already freed all enslaved people within rebelling states with the Emancipation Proclamation, but now it must be done away with altogether. He got the ball rolling at pushing the 13th Amendment through Congress to ban slavery, except as a form of punishment. Lincoln won re-election in November 1864 by a massive electoral margin. He was the first Northern president to be re-elected. Two of the Confederate states, Louisiana and Tennessee, held elections and also voted for Lincoln, but those electoral votes were invalidated given that the states hadn't yet properly rejoined the Union. This was Kansas, Nevada, and West Virginia's first election, West Virginia having separated from Virginia in opposition to the Confederacy. Lincoln would see the end of the Civil War, but not much else afterwards, as he was assassinated in Ford's Theatre by a Confederate sympathizer less than a week after the Confederacy surrender. Andrew Johnson assumed power and opted for a much swifter restoration of the former Confederate states back to the Union, without properly protecting the millions of formerly enslaved people now living alongside former masters as free people. Groups such as the Ku Klux Klan arose to keep black people in check and ensuring white supremacy remained firmly in place. Johnson ended up being impeached by the Republican-led Congress for vetoing so many attempts at Reconstruction in the South. But he was acquitted by a single vote. The National Union Party would dissolve, and the Republicans and Democrats once again were the two major opposing parties.
And that is where we will leave it for today, folks. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, hit the bell icon so you can find out when I post up part 3. I hope to have these done all before the inauguration. Like, obviously I should have one or two more out before then, but I hope to have the whole series complete. So if you want to support this work, please do so there. But for now, again, if you're watching this on Election Day 2024, and if you're watching afterwards, hi.